Widowed father hires dead wife's best friend as nanny. She's loved him for 15 years. Dean Ashbourne's hands trembled as he read the resignation letter. "I can't do this anymore," Sylvia whispered, her voice breaking as 8-year-old Georgia clung to her legs, sobbing. "You hired me to care for your daughter, not to watch you destroy yourself." The letter fluttered to the floor between them. "If you fire me now, you'll lose the only woman who's ever truly loved both of you." 3 months earlier, desperation had driven Dean to his breaking point. The 4th nanny in 6 months had quit without notice, leaving him staring at his phone at midnight, scrolling through agency websites that promised miracles he no longer believed in. George's tear-stained face haunted his thoughts as he remembered her pleading words that morning. "Why doesn't anyone want to stay with us, Daddy?" The truth cut deeper than he cared to admit. It wasn't that the nannies didn't want Georgia. His daughter was brilliant, artistic, and surprisingly resilient for someone who'd lost her mother at 6. The problem was Dean himself. His grief had calcified into a protective shell that made connecting impossible. He worked 16-hour days, communicated through terse notes, and maintained emotional distance that would freeze the warmest heart. Leah had been gone for 2 years, but Dean still lived like she might walk through the door any moment. Her coffee mug remained in the sink. Her art supplies sat untouched in the studio. Her side of the bed stayed perpetually cold because Dean couldn't bear to disturb the impression her head had left on the pillow. That's when Sylvia's name surfaced in his memory, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Sylvia Astoria had been Leah's best friend since college, the maid of honor at their wedding, Georgia's honorary aunt who sent birthday cards from across the country and called every Christmas. She was also, Dean realized with uncomfortable clarity, the woman who disappeared from their lives the moment Leah's cancer diagnosis became terminal. He'd always wondered why. Now, at 3 a.m, staring at his daughter's empty school lunchbox and knowing he had no one to care for her tomorrow, Dean found himself dialing Sylvia's number. "Dean?" Her voice carried sleep and surprise in equal measure. "Is everything okay?" "Is Georgia—" "She's fine," he interrupted, then immediately felt foolish for calling so late. "I'm sorry, I know it's the middle of the night. I need help." The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 years of unspoken grief and the weight of a friendship that had died alongside his wife. "What kind of help?" Sylvia's voice softened, and Dean could picture her sitting up in bed, instantly alert the way she had always been during Leah's worst nights. "I need a nanny for Georgia. Someone who understands, who knew Leah, someone Georgia can trust." The words tumbled out faster than he intended. "I know you have your own life in Chicago, your teaching position, but I'm desperate, Sylvia. I'm failing her." Another pause, longer this time. Dean could hear the soft rustle of movement, the quiet intake of breath that meant Sylvia was processing something difficult. "How long?" she asked finally. "I don't know, a few weeks, maybe a month, just until I can find someone permanent." "Dean." Her voice carried a note of something he couldn't identify, pain maybe, or fear. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Please." The word escaped before his pride could stop it. "Georgia asks about you sometimes. She remembers how you used to braid her hair, how you taught her to paint watercolor flowers like her mother. She needs someone who remembers Leah with love, not someone who sees her as just another job." The silence stretched so long Dean wondered if the call had dropped. Then Sylvia whispered, "I'll drive down this weekend. We can talk then." 3 days later, Dean opened his front door to find Sylvia Astoria standing on his porch, and his carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She was breathtaking in a way that made his chest tighten with guilt. At 33, Sylvia had grown into the beauty that had been merely promised at 18. Her dark skin seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight, and her natural hair framed her face in elegant coils that caught golden highlights. She wore a simple blue dress that emphasized her graceful movements, and when she smiled nervously, Dean felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought died with Leah. "Hello, Dean." Her voice carried the same warm cadence he remembered, but there was a new note of uncertainty that made him realize how much time had passed since they'd been comfortable with each other. "Sylvia." He stepped back to let her enter, acutely aware of how shabby his once pristine home had become. Leah's organizational systems had crumbled along with everything else, leaving behind a house that functioned but no longer felt like a home. George's excited shriek from the top of the stairs saved him from having to find appropriate words. "Aunt Sylvia!" His daughter flew down the stairs with 8-year-old abandon, launching herself into Sylvia's arms with complete trust. Dean watched Sylvia catch her easily, spinning her once before setting her down, and something in his chest cracked open at the sight of George's genuine joy. "Look how tall you've gotten." Sylvia knelt to George's eye level, studying her with the focused attention that had always made people feel treasured. "And your hair, it's so long and beautiful." "Daddy doesn't know how to braid it like Mommy did," Georgia said matter-of-factly, then brightened. "Can you teach him?" Dean watched Sylvia's face carefully, searching for the discomfort he expected at George's casual mention of Leah. Instead, he saw only gentle understanding and something that looked almost like relief. "I think your daddy has enough to learn. Right now," Sylvia said diplomatically. "But I could braid it for you if you'd like." "Yes!" Georgia clapped her hands together. "And can you stay for dinner? Daddy makes terrible mac and cheese, but he tries really hard." Heat crept up Dean's neck. "I'm sure Sylvia has plans." "Actually, I cleared my weekend," Sylvia said, standing gracefully. "I thought we might need time to talk." The afternoon passed in a blur of George's chatter and Sylvia's gentle questions. Dean found himself watching from doorways as Sylvia moved through his home with careful familiarity, straightening pillows Leah had arranged, running her fingers over picture frames that hadn't been dusted in months. In the kitchen, she began preparing dinner without being asked, her movements economical and confident. Dean leaned against the counter, ostensibly helping, but mostly observing the way Sylvia seemed to bring warmth back into spaces that had felt cold for 2 years. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly while Georgia played in the next room. Sylvia paused in her chopping of vegetables, her hands stilling on the knife. "Do what?" "Take care of us, fix our problems. I know this must be—" He gestured helplessly around the kitchen at the evidence of his domestic failures. "This can't be easy for you being here." She set down the knife and turned to face him fully. "Dean, I loved Leah like a sister. Georgia is as precious to me as if she were my own daughter. Being here isn't a burden. It's where I should have been all along." "Then why weren't you?" The question escaped before he could stop it, carrying 2 years of hurt and confusion. Sylvia's face went very still. "Because I'm a coward," she said simply, "and because some truths are too dangerous to live with." Before Dean could ask what she meant, Georgia burst into the kitchen demanding to help with dinner, and the moment passed. But as they worked together to prepare the meal, Sylvia guiding Georgia's small hands as she stirred the sauce while Dean managed the pasta, something shifted in the house's atmosphere. For the first time since Leah's death, Dean's kitchen felt alive. During dinner, Georgia regaled Sylvia with stories about school, her art classes, and her new friend Annie, who had 2 moms and thought that was perfectly normal. Dean found himself relaxing as he watched his daughter's animated face, seeing echoes of the vibrant child she'd been before grief had dimmed their household's light. "Daddy's building a really big building downtown," Georgia announced proudly. "It's going to have gardens on every floor and solar panels that look like flower petals." "Solar panels shaped like flower petals?" Sylvia raised an eyebrow at Dean. "That sounds like something Leah would have loved." Dean's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "She actually helped design them," he admitted quietly. "It was one of her last projects before, well, I'm finishing it for her." "Of course you are." Sylvia's voice carried understanding and something deeper. Pride, maybe. "Leah always said you were the only architect who could make buildings dream." The familiar ache of loss pressed against Dean's ribs, but for once, it didn't feel like drowning. Instead, it felt like remembering how to breathe. After dinner, while Georgia played with her art supplies in the living room, Dean and Sylvia sat on the back porch with coffee, watching the sunset paint Leah's garden in shades of gold and amber. The roses she'd planted were overgrown now, wild and beautiful in their neglect. "I should have kept up with the garden," Dean said, following Sylvia's gaze to the tangle of blooms. "Gardens have their own wisdom," Sylvia replied softly. "Sometimes wild growth is exactly what's needed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of unspoken words settling between them like autumn leaves. "Will you do it?" Dean asked finally. "Will you stay and help us?" Sylvia turned to study his face in the fading light. "For how long?" "I don't know." He met her eyes, seeing his own exhaustion reflected there, along with something else he couldn't name. "Until we figure out how to be a family again, I suppose." "Dean." She hesitated, worrying her lower lip between her teeth. "There are things you don't know about me. About why I stayed away. About, I don't care." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. "I don't care about the past, Sylvia. I care about my daughter, and she's happier tonight than she's been in 2 years. If you can give her that, then whatever else you're worried about doesn't matter." Sylvia was quiet for so long, Dean wondered if he'd pushed too hard. Then she nodded once, decisively. "I'll need to give my school 2 weeks' notice. Arrange for a substitute." She looked at him directly. "This is temporary, Dean. I want to be clear about that. I'm helping you find your footing again, not replacing anyone permanently." "Of course," Dean agreed, though something in his chest protested the limitation. Temporary. That night, after Sylvia had braided George's hair and tucked her into bed with a story about brave princesses and magical gardens, Dean found himself standing in his empty living room, listening to the sounds of someone else moving through his house. Water running in the guest bathroom, footsteps on the stairs, the quiet closing of a door. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't alone. And for the first time since Leah's death, that didn't terrify him. Have you ever felt guilty for wanting happiness after loss, like Sylvia torn between loyalty to her best friend's memory and her own heart? Tell me your story in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if this emotional journey is already touching your soul. 2 weeks later, Sylvia returned with 3 suitcases and a determination to rebuild what grief had broken. Dean watched from his home office window as she pulled into the driveway, her small car packed with the pieces of a life she'd temporarily abandoned to save theirs. Georgia practically vibrated with excitement, having counted down the days since Sylvia's departure with the intensity of a child waiting for Christmas. She'd drawn welcome home pictures, organized her art supplies to share, and asked Dean no fewer than 50 times if he thought Sylvia might change her mind. "She'll stay," Dean had assured his daughter, though privately he'd wondered if Sylvia would find reasons to back out. She promised. Now, watching Sylvia gather her bags with steady purpose, Dean felt his own anticipation rise. The house had felt different during her 2-week absence, not empty the way it had before, but expectant, like a theater waiting for the show to begin. The front door opened before Sylvia could knock, Georgia bursting onto the porch with arms spread wide. "You came back." "Of course I came back," Sylvia laughed, catching Georgia in a fierce hug. "I promised, didn't I?" Dean appeared in the doorway, and Sylvia felt her breath catch at the sight of him. He looked better than he had 2 weeks ago, less gray around the edges, more present somehow. He'd gotten a haircut and was wearing a blue shirt that brought out his eyes, and when he smiled at the scene before him, Sylvia felt her carefully constructed walls wobble dangerously. Welcome home, Dean said, reaching for her heaviest suitcase. Their fingers brushed as she handed it over, and the contact sent warmth shooting up her arm. Thank you. She kept her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. It feels good to be back. As they settled into their new routine over the following days, Sylvia marveled at how naturally the pieces fell into place. She woke early to prepare George's breakfast and lunch, braided her hair while Dean showered, and walked her to the school bus stop each morning. Afternoons were spent helping with homework, organizing play dates, and slowly bringing order back to the domestic chaos that had reigned for 2 years. Dean, for his part, found himself coming home earlier and earlier, drawn by the warm lights in the kitchen windows and the sound of laughter echoing from inside. Where once he'd dreaded the evening routine, the struggle to prepare dinner, the battles over bedtime, the lonely hours after Georgia fell asleep, now he looked forward to family time with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened him. It was during the 3rd week of this new arrangement that the first crack in their careful professional boundaries appeared. Dean had been working late in his home office, lost in blueprints and calculations, when he heard George's voice calling from upstairs. Not urgent, but persistent enough to pull him from his concentration. "Daddy? Daddy, I need you." He climbed the stairs to find George's bedroom door open and his daughter sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. Sylvia sat beside her, stroking her hair and speaking in low, comforting tones. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Dean settled on George's other side, immediately alert for signs of illness or injury. "Bad dream," Georgia hiccuped, "about Mommy. She was calling for me, but I couldn't find her. And there were roses everywhere, but they were all brown and dead and—" "Shh," Sylvia soothed, producing a tissue from seemingly nowhere. "It was just a dream, baby girl. Dreams can't hurt you." "But what if Mommy's lost somewhere and she needs me?" George's voice broke on the words. "What if she thinks I forgot about her?" Dean felt his own throat tighten. "Oh, Georgia, Mommy isn't lost. She's in every beautiful thing you see," Sylvia interrupted gently. "In the roses in the garden, even when they're sleeping for winter. In the paintings you make that look just like hers, in the way your daddy's eyes light up when you laugh." Georgia considered this, wiping her nose with the tissue. "Really? Really?" Sylvia brushed a curl away from George's forehead. "And you know what? I used to have dreams about your Mommy too after she went to heaven. Want to know what helped me?" Georgia nodded eagerly. "I started telling myself all the stories I could remember about her. Happy stories, funny stories, stories about the adventures we had together. The more happy stories I remembered, the more the sad dreams went away." "Will you tell me a story about Mommy?" Georgia asked, settling back against her pillows. Dean watched as Sylvia's face softened with memory. "Once upon a time, your Mommy decided she was going to learn how to make the perfect chocolate chip cookies. Not just good ones, perfect ones. So she spent an entire weekend testing different recipes, adjusting temperatures, timing everything down to the second." "Did she burn them?" Georgia giggled, already knowing the answer. "Oh, she burned them, all right. She burned so many batches that the kitchen looked like a flour bomb had exploded. Your daddy came home to find her covered head to toe in chocolate and flour, standing in front of a mountain of burnt cookies, declaring that she was going to master this if it killed her." Dean smiled at the memory. "She made me taste every single burnt cookie and rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 levels of disaster." "What did Daddy do?" Georgia asked Sylvia. "He went to the store and bought the biggest bag of chocolate chips he could find, came home and said, 'Let's figure this out together.' And they spent the rest of the night perfecting the recipe that we all love so much." "The ones with the secret ingredient," Georgia said solemnly. "Love," Sylvia confirmed. "The secret ingredient was always love." Dean watched his daughter's face relax as the story worked its magic, her breathing gradually evening out, as Sylvia continued with gentle tales of Leah's various domestic adventures. But what captured his attention more was Sylvia herself, the way her voice carried both affection and grief, how her hands moved expressively as she spoke, the care with which she wove memories into healing. When George's eyes finally drifted closed, Sylvia carefully extracted herself from the bed and followed Dean into the hallway. They stood in the dim light, suddenly aware of their proximity and the intimate nature of what they'd just shared. "Thank you," Dean said quietly. "I never know what to say when she has those dreams." "The stories help," Sylvia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They help me too." They stood there in the hallway, close enough that Dean could catch the faint scent of Sylvia's perfume, something warm and subtle that seemed to wrap around him like comfort itself. The silence stretched between them, loaded with awareness and unspoken words. "Sylvia," Dean began, not sure what he intended to say, but knowing he needed to say something. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the soft hallway light, and for a moment time seemed suspended. Dean felt pulled forward by a force he didn't understand, drawn to the warmth and safety she represented. Then Sylvia stepped back, breaking the spell. "I should let you get back to work," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Georgia should sleep through the rest of the night now." "Right," Dean agreed, though he made no move to return to his office. "Thank you again." "Of course." Sylvia's smile was warm but distant. "That's what I'm here for." As she disappeared into the guest room, Dean stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to name the feeling that had passed between them. Whatever it was, it felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. He went to bed that night with the sound of Sylvia's voice still echoing in his ears, telling stories that made painful memories feel like treasures instead of wounds. And in the morning, when he came downstairs to find her humming softly as she prepared George's lunch, Dean realized that somewhere in the space between professional assistance and family intimacy, the lines had begun to blur in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. The woman who was supposed to be helping him heal from one love was slowly, carefully teaching his heart to beat again. Chapter 2. The morning after George's nightmare marked a shift in the household's rhythm. Dean found himself lingering over breakfast, reluctant to leave the warm circle of domesticity that Sylvia had created. She moved around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, packing George's lunch while simultaneously helping with homework and braiding hair into neat plaits. "The Peterson account meeting is at 10, Dean mentioned, checking his phone for messages. "I should be home by 6. "Take your time," Sylvia replied, not looking up from George's math worksheet. "We're making dinner together tonight, aren't we, Georgia?" "Sylvia's teaching me how to make Mommy's favorite soup," Georgia announced proudly. "The one with the little star noodles." Dean's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. Leah's tortellini soup had been a family staple, one of the many traditions that had died along with her. "You remember the recipe?" "She made it for me when I had the flu sophomore year," Sylvia said softly. "I wrote it down because it was the first time anyone had ever taken care of me like that." The simple statement hit Dean with unexpected force. He realized he knew almost nothing about Sylvia's family, her childhood, the experiences that had shaped her into the woman who now moved through his home with such grace. "Your parents," he began, then stopped, unsure if he was crossing a line. "We're very busy people," Sylvia finished diplomatically. Leah was better at the nurturing thing. Georgia, oblivious to the undercurrents, bounced with excitement. "Can we use the good bowls? The ones with the flowers that Mommy liked?" "Of course," Sylvia and Dean said simultaneously, then caught each other's eyes across the table. The moment of shared understanding sent warmth through Dean's chest. By evening, the kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and George's excited chatter filled the spaces between comfortable silences. Dean arrived home to find Sylvia teaching his daughter to roll pasta, both of them dusted with flour and laughing at some shared joke. "Perfect timing," Sylvia called without turning around. "We need someone tall to reach the good bowls." Dean washed his hands and retrieved the china from the high cabinet, acutely aware of Sylvia beside him as she stirred the simmering pot. Her shoulder brushed his arm as she reached for salt, and the brief contact sent electricity through his system. "Careful," she murmured as he nearly fumbled the bowls. "These are irreplaceable." "So are you," Dean replied without thinking, then felt heat creep up his neck as Sylvia's stirring motion faltered. "The soup," she said quickly. "I meant the soup is irreplaceable. Leah's recipe." "Of course," Dean agreed, though they both knew that wasn't what he'd meant. Dinner felt like a celebration, though no one could have said exactly what they were celebrating. Georgia regaled them with stories from school, her teacher Miss Annie's latest art project, and her plans for the upcoming school talent show. "I want to do a painting," Georgia announced, "like Mommy used to do, but also like the one Sylvia teaches her kids in Chicago." "What would you paint?" Sylvia asked, serving another portion of soup. "Our family," Georgia said matter-of-factly. "You and me and Daddy and Mommy's garden." "Because that's where we're happiest." Dean's spoon clinked against his bowl as George's casual inclusion of Sylvia and their family portrait hit him. When had that happened? When had his daughter begun thinking of them as a unit of 3 instead of a broken unit of 2? "That sounds beautiful, sweetheart," he managed. After Georgia went to bed, Dean and Sylvia cleaned the kitchen together, moving around each other with increasing familiarity. Dean washed, while Sylvia dried, their hands occasionally touching as dishes changed hands. "She's getting attached," Dean said quietly, voicing the concern that had been growing in his mind. "To me?" Sylvia's hand stilled on the towel. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know." Dean turned off the water and faced her. "What happens when you go back to Chicago? When this temporary arrangement ends?" Sylvia set down the dish she'd been drying, her expression carefully neutral. "We'll figure that out when the time comes." "But there will come a time," Dean pressed. "You have a life there, a career. This was never meant to be permanent." "No," Sylvia agreed softly. "It wasn't." They stood facing each other across the kitchen island, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Dean wanted to ask why she'd really stayed away after Leah's death, what secrets she carried that made her so careful around him, why she sometimes looked at him with such pain in her eyes. Instead, he said, "I should check on the Peterson drawings." "Of course," Sylvia replied, but neither of them moved. The next few days passed in a blur of carefully maintained normalcy, but the tension was building like pressure in a sealed container. Dean found himself watching Sylvia when she wasn't looking, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, how she sang softly while cooking, the gentle competence with which she guided Georgia through homework and bath time. On Thursday afternoon, Dean came home early to find Sylvia standing on a ladder in the living room, hanging one of George's paintings where a family photo used to sit. She was stretched up on her toes, trying to adjust the frame's position, when Dean walked in. "Let me help," he said, moving quickly as the ladder wobbled. His hands found her waist to steady her, and Sylvia gasped at the unexpected contact. She looked down to find Dean's face inches from hers, his blue eyes dark with concern and something deeper. "I've got you," he said quietly, his hands firm and warm against her sides. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in Dean's eyes, could smell his cologne mixed with the clean scent of soap. Her hands gripped the ladder frame as awareness crashed over her like a wave. "The painting," she whispered, though she made no move to finish hanging it. "The painting can wait," Dean replied, his voice rough around the edges. They stared at each other, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fragile. Dean's thumbs traced small circles against Sylvia's waist through her shirt, and she felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Dean," she began, but before she could finish the thought, George's voice called from the front porch. "I'm home. Where is everyone?" Dean stepped back so quickly that Sylvia nearly lost her balance on the ladder. By the time Georgia burst through the front door, they were on opposite sides of the room, both breathing too fast and avoiding eye contact. "What are you hanging?" Georgia asked, dropping her backpack and examining the painting. "Oh, it's my flower garden. It looks perfect there." "Your daddy helped me get it straight," Sylvia said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "Daddy's good at making things straight," Georgia agreed innocently. "That's why he builds buildings." Dean cleared his throat. "How was school, sweetheart?" As Georgia launched into her daily recap, Dean found himself stealing glances at Sylvia, who seemed determinedly focused on his daughter's every word. But he could see the flush still coloring her cheeks, the way her hands trembled slightly as she helped Georgia with her jacket. Something had shifted between them on that ladder, something that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored. That evening, while Dean helped Georgia with her math homework at the kitchen table, Sylvia worked quietly at the stove. But there was a new awareness in the air, a charge that made every casual interaction feel weighted with possibility. "Daddy," Georgia said suddenly, looking up from her multiplication tables, "why do you keep looking at Sylvia?" Heat flooded Dean's face. "I'm not. You are too," Georgia insisted with 8-year-old certainty. "You get the same look Mommy used to get when she watched you working in the garden, like you're thinking happy thoughts." Dean's pencil stilled on the paper. "What kind of look is that?" "Love," Georgia said matter-of-factly, then returned to her math as if she hadn't just detonated an emotional bomb in the middle of the kitchen. Dean risked a glance at Sylvia, who had gone very still at the stove. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and in that moment, something passed between them that felt like recognition, like admission, like the first crack in a dam that had been holding back 2 years of suppressed longing. Later that night, after Georgia was asleep and Dean had retreated to his office to work, Sylvia found herself standing in Leah's art studio. She'd been avoiding this room since her return, unable to face the canvases that stood like sentinels guarding memories too precious and painful to disturb. But tonight, drawn by a force she couldn't name, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating easels draped in white sheets like ghosts of creativity past. Sylvia moved carefully through the space, running her fingers over brushes still crusty with dried paint, breathing in the faint scent of turpentine and dreams deferred. She used to paint here until 3 in the morning sometimes. Sylvia spun around to find Dean standing in the doorway, his expression soft with memory. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just—" "It's okay." Dean stepped into the room, his presence filling the space with warmth. "I haven't been in here since before she got sick. It felt too much like disturbing sacred ground." They stood together in the moonlit studio, surrounded by the evidence of Leah's passion and talent. Sylvia moved to one of the covered easels and hesitated, her hand hovering over the sheet. "May I?" Dean nodded, though his jaw tightened with anticipated pain. Sylvia lifted the corner of the sheet to reveal a half-finished painting of the garden in spring, roses in full bloom and sunlight dancing through green leaves. In the corner, barely sketched but unmistakably present, were the figures of a man and a little girl, their faces turned toward each other in laughter. "She was painting this the week before her diagnosis," Dean said quietly. "She never got to finish it." "It's beautiful," Sylvia whispered. "She captured so much joy." That was Leah. She could find joy in anything. Dean moved closer, studying the painting with fresh eyes. She would have loved knowing that George's artwork is hanging where this used to be. Would she? Sylvia's question carried deeper meaning. Would she have loved all the changes? Dean turned to look at her, understanding the real question behind her words. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "She would have loved knowing that you're here, taking care of Georgia. Taking care of us." "Dean, I know this is complicated, he continued, moving closer. I know we agreed this was temporary, professional, but I can't pretend anymore that what's happening between us feels like either of those things. Sylvia's heart hammered against her ribs. What's happening between us? Dean reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with reverent gentleness. I think you know. She did know. She'd known for 15 years, had carried the knowledge like a secret flame that threatened to consume her if she wasn't careful. But hearing him acknowledge it, seeing the want in his eyes that matched her own, made it real in a way that terrified her. I can't, she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. Leah was my best friend. This is her home, her husband, her daughter. I can't. You're not taking anything from her, Dean said firmly. You're giving us back our lives. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, and Sylvia's resolve crumbled. 2 years of grief, 15 years of hidden love, and months of growing intimacy crystallized into this moment, this choice, this man whose blue eyes held promises she'd never dared to dream. Dean, she breathed, his name a prayer and a surrender. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Tell me to stop, and I will. Tell me this is wrong, and I'll walk away right now. Instead of speaking, Sylvia rose on her toes and touched her lips to his. The kiss started gentle, tentative, like the first notes of a song they were afraid to sing. But then Dean's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and 15 years of suppressed longing erupted between them like a dam finally giving way. Sylvia's hands fisted in Dean's shirt as he deepened the kiss, his mouth moving against hers with desperate hunger. She tasted like hope and healing, like everything he'd thought he'd lost forever. Her soft sounds of pleasure sent fire through his veins, and he pressed her back against the covered easel, his body caging her in protective warmth. I've wanted this for so long, Sylvia gasped against his mouth. Since the day Leah introduced us, I know, Dean groaned, his lips finding the sensitive spot below her ear. God, Sylvia, I know, I felt it too. Her confession hung in the air between them, honest and devastating. Dean pulled back to look at her face, seeing his own wonder reflected in her dark eyes. 15 years, he whispered, cupping her face in his hands. 15 years of pretending, of burying this because it felt like betrayal. It was betrayal, Sylvia said, tears gathering in her eyes. I loved her, Dean. She was my best friend, and I wanted her husband from the moment I met him. But you never acted on it, Dean reminded her gently. You never said anything, never did anything to hurt our marriage. You loved her enough to disappear rather than cause problems. Is that why you think I stayed away? Sylvia's voice broke. Because I was noble and self-sacrificing? Weren't you? She shook her head, fresh tears spilling over. I stayed away because I couldn't watch her die, knowing that I was secretly glad I might finally have a chance with you. What kind of friend does that make me? Dean's heart shattered at the pain in her voice, at the guilt she'd been carrying like stones in her chest. It makes you human, he said fiercely. It makes you a woman who loved deeply and hurt quietly and deserves forgiveness, especially from herself. He kissed her again, pouring all his understanding and acceptance into the contact. Sylvia melted against him, her arms winding around his neck as she finally allowed herself to feel everything she'd suppressed for so long. They kissed in the moonlight, surrounded by Leah's unfinished dreams, and somehow it felt like blessing rather than betrayal. Like Leah's spirit was giving them permission to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dean rested his forehead against Sylvia's. What happens now? She whispered. I don't know, Dean admitted, but I know I don't want to pretend anymore that you're just George's nanny. I don't want to pretend that having you here doesn't make me feel alive again. Before Sylvia could respond, a small voice called from the hallway. Daddy? I heard voices. Is everything okay? They sprang apart like teenagers caught by parents, both breathing too fast and trying to look innocent. Dean quickly moved to the doorway where Georgia stood rubbing her eyes, her hair mussed from sleep. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Dean said, his voice only slightly rough. "Sylvia and I were just looking at Mommy's paintings." Georgia peered past him into the studio where Sylvia was hastily recovering the easel they'd disturbed. "Can I see too?" Georgia asked. "Maybe tomorrow," Dean suggested. "It's past your bedtime." "Will you tell me a story?" Georgia asked, then looked hopefully at Sylvia. "Both of you?" Dean and Sylvia exchanged a look loaded with new awareness and unresolved tension. "Of course," Sylvia said, moving toward Georgia with a smile that only trembled slightly. "What kind of story would you like?" As they tucked Georgia back into bed and took turns spinning a tale about brave princesses and magical gardens, Dean found himself watching Sylvia with new eyes. The way she smoothed George's hair, the gentle patience in her voice, the natural maternal grace that had drawn him from the very beginning. It all felt different now, charged with possibility and promise. When Georgia finally drifted off to sleep, they found themselves standing in the hallway again, the scene of their earlier near miss. But this time, instead of stepping away, Sylvia moved closer. "Dean," she began, her voice soft in the dim light. "I know," he said, understanding the question she couldn't quite ask. "We need to talk about this, about what it means, about Georgia, about whether we're betraying Leah's memory or honoring it," Sylvia finished. "Tomorrow," Dean decided, "when we can think clearly and Georgia's at school. Tonight I just want to—" "What?" He reached out and took her hand, threading their fingers together. "I want to not pretend just for tonight. I want to hold your hand and remember what it feels like to hope for something." Sylvia squeezed his fingers, her heart full to overflowing. "I'd like that too." They stood in the hallway, holding hands like teenagers, both afraid to push too hard too fast, but unwilling to step back into the safe distance they had maintained for weeks. Finally, reluctantly, they said goodnight at Sylvia's bedroom door, the kiss they shared brief but filled with promise. Dean lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of their evening together. Across the hall, Sylvia did the same, both of them acutely aware of the other's presence, of the shift that had occurred between them, of the impossible becoming suddenly, terrifyingly possible. The next morning brought autumn's first real storm, sheets of rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the trees. George's school called to announce an early dismissal due to weather, and Dean found himself racing home through flooding streets to beat the worst of the storm. He arrived to find Sylvia pacing the living room, cell phone pressed to her ear, worry creasing her forehead. "No, I understand," she was saying. "Just keep the children inside until their parents arrive. Yes, I'll be there as soon as I can." "What's wrong?" Dean asked, shaking rain from his jacket. "The buses can't run in this weather," Sylvia explained, grabbing her raincoat. "Parents have to pick up their children directly from school. The roads are getting worse by the minute." "I'll drive," Dean said immediately. "My truck handles better in weather like this." They made the trip to George's school in tense silence, the windshield wipers barely keeping pace with the driving rain. The parking lot was chaos. Parents running through puddles, teachers directing traffic, children pressed against windows watching the storm with wide eyes. Dean waited in the truck while Sylvia ran inside to collect Georgia, and when they emerged, his daughter launched herself into the back seat with the dramatic flair of someone who'd survived a great adventure. "That was so cool," Georgia announced. "Miss Annie said this is the worst storm in 10 years. The playground is completely flooded." "Everyone buckled in?" Dean asked, checking his mirrors before pulling carefully out of the parking lot. The drive home took twice as long as usual, Dean navigating around fallen branches and standing water, while Sylvia kept one hand on the door handle and her eyes on the road ahead. Georgia chattered excitedly in the back seat, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. They were almost home when the power lines came down. Dean saw the flash in his peripheral vision and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, tires sliding on the wet pavement as electrical wires sparked and danced across the road behind them. "Everyone okay?" he asked, heart hammering as he pulled into their driveway. "That was like a movie," Georgia exclaimed. Sylvia's face was pale, but she managed a shaky smile. "Very exciting." Inside the house, they discovered what Dean had suspected. The storm had knocked out their power along with half the neighborhood. While Sylvia helped Georgia change into dry clothes, Dean gathered candles and checked their emergency supplies. "It's like camping," Georgia declared when they reconvened in the living room, flashlights and candles creating dancing shadows on the walls. "Indoor camping," Sylvia agreed, settling beside Georgia on the couch. "What should we do first?" "Tell stories," Georgia said immediately. "Scary ones, since it's dark." "Not too scary," Dean warned, settling into his chair across from them. "We still have to sleep tonight." What followed was an evening unlike any they'd shared before. With no television, no computers, no electronic distractions, they were forced into the kind of intimate togetherness that had become rare in their modern world. They told stories, played card games by candlelight, and shared a dinner of sandwiches and soup heated over the gas stove. Georgia fell asleep on the couch during their third round of 20 questions, curled under a blanket with her head in Sylvia's lap. Dean watched Sylvia's fingers gently stroking his daughter's hair and felt his chest tight with emotion he could no longer deny. "She's gotten so attached to you," he said quietly. "I've gotten attached too," Sylvia replied, not looking up from George's peaceful face. "More than I should. Have. Why shouldn't you?" Dean moved to sit beside them on the couch, careful not to disturb Georgia. "She needs you. We both do." "For now," Sylvia said. "But what happens when you don't need me anymore? When you're ready to move forward with your life?" "What if moving forward includes you?" Dean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sylvia's hand stilled in George's hair. "Dean, I know it's complicated. I know we have things to figure out, but last night, in the studio, when you kissed me..." He reached out and covered her free hand with his. "That didn't feel like something temporary or professional. That felt like coming home." "It did," Sylvia admitted, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But coming home and staying home are two different things." "Then stay," Dean said simply. "Not as George's nanny, not as a temporary solution to our problems. Stay because this is where you belong. Stay because..." "Because what?" He took a shaky breath, knowing that once he said the words, there would be no taking them back. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you. Because I think I've been falling in love with you for months, maybe years, and I'm tired of fighting it." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Sylvia stared at him in the flickering candlelight, her eyes wide with wonder and terror. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "I've never meant anything more in my life." "But Leah would want us to be happy," Dean finished. "You know she would. She loved us both too much to want us to spend our lives alone and grieving." Sylvia's tears spilled over then, months of suppressed emotion finally finding release. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you for so long, it feels like breathing. But I'm so scared, Dean. What if we're making a mistake? What if we're just two broken people clinging to each other because we're afraid to be alone?" "Maybe we are," Dean said, reaching up to wipe her tears away. "But maybe that's exactly what love is, choosing to be broken together instead of whole apart." Before Sylvia could respond, the lights flickered and came back on, sudden and bright after hours of candlelight. Georgia stirred in Sylvia's lap, blinking up at them with sleepy confusion. "Is the storm over?" she asked. Dean and Sylvia looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Some storms were just beginning, but others were finally coming to an end. "The power's back on," Dean said, smoothing George's hair. "But I think we should still sleep in the living room tonight, just to be safe." All together? Georgia asked hopefully. All together, Sylvia agreed, her voice soft with new understanding. As they arranged blankets and pillows on the couches, creating a makeshift campsite in their own living room, Dean caught Sylvia's eye across the space. The look that passed between them was full of promise and possibility, of love finally acknowledged and fear finally faced. They fell asleep to the sound of rain on the windows and the quiet breathing of their little family. And for the first time in 2 years, Dean's dreams were filled with light instead of loss. When morning came, bringing sunshine and the ordinary bustle of a new day, they would have to figure out what came next. They would have to navigate the complex terrain of love built on grief, of hearts that had learned to hope again. But tonight, in the warm glow of candlelight and new understanding, they simply held each other and let themselves believe that some storms were worth weathering together. Chapter 3. The morning after the storm brought more than just sunshine. It brought clarity and a new understanding that neither Dean nor Sylvia could ignore. They woke tangled together on the living room couch, Georgia curled between them like a bridge connecting two hearts that had finally found their way to each other. Dean opened his eyes first, immediately aware of Sylvia's warm presence beside him, her hand resting on his chest where it had fallen during sleep. For a moment, he simply lay still, drinking in the rightness of the scene, his daughter safe and peaceful, the woman he loved close enough to touch, sunlight streaming through windows that had weathered the storm. Sylvia stirred next, her eyes fluttering open to find Dean watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. They stared at each other over George's sleeping form, last night's confessions hanging in the air between them, like promises waiting to be fulfilled. "Good morning," Dean whispered, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "Good morning," Sylvia replied, making no move to pull away from their intimate arrangement. "Did we really say we loved each other?" Dean's smile was soft and sure. "Yes, we did." A blush crept up Sylvia's neck, but she didn't look away. "No taking it back now." "Never," Dean said firmly. "Even if you wanted to, which I hope you don't." "I don't," Sylvia admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm terrified, but I don't want to take it back." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by George's yawn and stretch as she woke up between them. "This was the best sleepover ever," Georgia announced, sitting up and looking around at their makeshift campsite. "Can we do it again tonight?" Dean and Sylvia exchanged a look full of shared understanding and amusement. "We'll see," Dean said diplomatically. "But right now, I think we should probably get you ready for school." "Oh, do I have to?" Georgia whined. "Can't we just stay home and have another adventure?" "School's an adventure too," Sylvia said, tickling Georgia's ribs until she giggled. "And Miss Annie is probably worried about all her students after yesterday's storm." As they went through their morning routine, Dean and Sylvia moved around each other with new awareness. Every casual touch, passing coffee cups, helping with George's backpack, their hands meeting as they both reached for the same piece of toast, felt charged with significance. Georgia, in the way of perceptive children, noticed the change immediately. "You both look different this morning," she announced over breakfast. "Happy different." "Different how?" Sylvia asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Like you have a secret," Georgia said, studying them with 8-year-old intensity. "A good secret that makes you want to smile all the time." Dean nearly choked on his orange juice, while Sylvia found sudden fascination with her scrambled eggs. "Adults don't have secrets from little girls," Dean said, reaching over to ruffle George's hair. "We just had a nice evening together, that's all." Georgia said, clearly unconvinced but willing to let it slide for now. "Can Sylvia come to my school art show next week? I want her to see my painting of our family." "Of course I'll come," Sylvia said quickly, then paused. "If your daddy thinks that's appropriate." Dean met her eyes across the table. "I think it's very appropriate. We're family, aren't we?" The simple statement carried weight that both adults understood. Georgia beamed with delight, but Sylvia felt tears prick her eyes at the casual way Dean had claimed her as family. After Georgia left for school, Dean and Sylvia found themselves alone in the kitchen, suddenly shy with each other despite the intimacy they'd shared the night before. "So," Dean said, leaning against the counter with studied casualness, "we should probably talk about what happens next." "Yes," Sylvia agreed, then immediately busied herself with cleaning dishes that were already clean. "We should definitely talk." Neither of them moved to initiate the conversation. Finally, Dean pushed off from the counter and crossed to where Sylvia stood at the sink. He gently took the dish towel from her hands and set it aside, then turned her to face him. "I meant what I said last night," he said quietly. "All of it." "So did I," Sylvia replied, looking up into his blue eyes. "But saying it and living it are two different things." "Then let's figure out how to live it," Dean suggested, his hands coming up to frame her face. "One day at a time, one choice at a time." He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and sure, and Sylvia felt her remaining reservations melt away. This was right. This was home. This was the love she'd waited 15 years to claim. When they broke apart, both breathing a little unsteadily, Dean rested his forehead against hers. "I have a confession," he said. "What's that?" "I've been thinking about doing that every morning for weeks," Dean admitted. "Standing here in the kitchen, watching you make coffee and pack George's lunch, wanting to kiss you good morning like we were a real couple." "We are a real couple now," Sylvia said, testing the words. "Aren't we?" "If you want to be," Dean replied. "If you're ready for all the complications that come with it." Sylvia thought about Jennifer's inevitable reaction, about her job in Chicago that she had already extended her leave from twice, about the delicate balance of honoring Leah's memory while building something new. "I'm ready," she said firmly, terrified but ready. The relief on Dean's face was answer enough. The next few days passed in a blur of careful navigation as they learned to be together in this new way. Dean came home earlier, lingering over dinner and evening routines. Sylvia found herself humming while she cooked, her step lighter and her smiles coming easier. Georgia basked in the increased happiness of her two favorite adults, though she seemed to accept their new dynamic without question. It was during this period of adjustment that Dr. William Olson made his next move. Sylvia was picking Georgia up from school on Thursday afternoon when William approached, his expression purposeful and determined. "Sylvia!" he called, jogging across the parking lot to catch her before she reached her car. "I'm glad I caught you." "Hello, William," Sylvia replied politely, helping Georgia into her car seat. "How are you?" "I'm well, thank you." He smiled warmly, then his expression grew more serious. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk privately. Perhaps over dinner tomorrow night." George's ears perked up from the back seat. "Are you asking Sylvia on a date, Dr. Olson?" Heat flooded Sylvia's cheeks. "Georgia, I am indeed," William said with good humor, though his eyes remained fixed on Sylvia's face. "I've been hoping for the chance to get to know you better outside of our professional interactions." Sylvia felt trapped between politeness and honesty, acutely aware of Georgia listening to every word. "That's very kind of you, William, but I'm afraid I can't. I'm involved with someone." Something flickered across William's face, surprise, disappointment, perhaps a touch of hurt. "I see. Anyone I know?" "Daddy," Georgia announced cheerfully before Sylvia could stop her. "Sylvia and Daddy are in love now. They think I don't know, but grown-ups are terrible at keeping secrets." The silence that followed was deafening. William's eyes widened as understanding dawned, while Sylvia wished the parking lot would open up and swallow her whole. "Georgia," Sylvia said weakly, "we talked about this." "You talked about not having secrets," Georgia corrected with 8-year-old logic, "so I'm telling the truth. Daddy looks at Sylvia the way Prince Eric looks at Ariel in the movie, and Sylvia gets all pink and smiley when Daddy comes home from work." William cleared his throat, clearly struggling to process this information. I had no idea, he said stiffly. Dean never mentioned. It's very recent, Sylvia said quickly, feeling the need to explain, though she wasn't sure why. And complicated. I imagine it would be, William replied, his tone cooling considerably. Well, I hope you'll both be very happy. He turned and walked away before Sylvia could respond, leaving her standing in the school parking lot feeling like she'd handled the entire situation badly. Did I say something wrong? Georgia asked as they drove home. Dr. Olson looked mad. Not mad, Sylvia said carefully, just surprised. Sometimes adults need time to adjust to new information. Are you going to tell Daddy about Dr. Olson asking you on a date? Sylvia met George's eyes in the rearview mirror. What do you think I should do? Tell him, Georgia said immediately. Daddy doesn't like secrets either. And besides, he should know that other people think you're pretty enough to ask on dates. The wisdom of 8-year-olds, Sylvia thought with a small smile. That evening, after Georgia was in bed, Sylvia found Dean in his home office, bent over architectural drawings. She knocked on the door frame, and he looked up with the smile that had become as necessary to her as breathing. Hey, he said, pushing back from his desk. How was your day? Interesting, Sylvia replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. I need to tell you something. Dean's expression sharpened at her serious tone. What's wrong? William Olson asked me out today, at George's school. Dean's pencil snapped between his fingers. He what? I told him no, obviously, Sylvia continued quickly. I told him I was involved with someone. Georgia, being Georgia, helpfully announced that we were in love. Georgia told William Olson that we were in love. Dean's voice was carefully controlled. She's more observant than we gave her credit for, Sylvia said. She's known something was different between us for days. Dean leaned back in his chair, processing this information. How did William react? About how you'd expect, Sylvia said. Surprised, disappointed, maybe a little hurt. I felt terrible. You felt terrible for turning down another man while you're with me? Dean's voice carried a note of something Sylvia couldn't quite identify. I felt terrible for hurting his feelings, Sylvia clarified. William's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of our complicated situation. Dean stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the garden. Maybe he has a point. What do you mean? Maybe we are being selfish, Dean said, his back still turned. William could offer you an uncomplicated relationship. No grief, no baggage, no 8-year-old daughter who's already too attached. He's successful, stable, available. And not you, Sylvia interrupted, rising from her chair to face him. Dean, where is this coming from? He turned around, his blue eyes dark with something that looked like fear. I've been thinking about what we're asking of you. You've put your entire life on hold to take care of us. Your job, your apartment, your future, all of it suspended while you help us heal. That's not fair to you. That was my choice, Sylvia said firmly. Was it? Or did we just make it impossible for you to say no? Dean ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. Georgia was heartbroken. I was desperate, and you've always been too generous for your own good. Maybe we took advantage of that. Sylvia stared at him in disbelief. Is that really what you think? That I'm here out of obligation? I think you're here because you loved Leah and you loved Georgia, Dean said. But that doesn't mean you should sacrifice your happiness for ours. And what if my happiness is here? Sylvia demanded, moving closer. What if everything I want is in this house, with this family, with you? Then you're settling, Dean said harshly. You're accepting half a life because it feels safer than risking everything for the whole thing. The words hit Sylvia like a physical blow. Half a life. You could have children of your own, Dean continued, his voice growing rougher. A husband who chose you first, not as a replacement for someone else. A life that isn't built on the foundation of another woman's death. Stop, Sylvia said, tears starting to fall. Just stop. But Dean couldn't stop, the fear and guilt he'd been carrying finally erupting. William could give you all of that, a fresh start, no complications, no competing with a ghost. I said stop! Sylvia's voice cracked with pain and anger. How dare you decide what I want? How dare you choose for me? Dean fell silent, seeing the hurt in her eyes and realizing he'd gone too far. You want to know what half a life looks like? Sylvia continued, wiping angrily at her tears. Half a life is spent in 15 years loving someone who can't love you back. Half a life is watching your best friend marry the man of your dreams and pretending to be happy about it. Half a life is staying away while she died because you couldn't trust yourself to be there without wanting what was hers. She moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more impact than shouting. But this? Us? Georgia calling me family and you kissing me like I'm the answer to prayers you were afraid to pray? This isn't half a life, Dean. This is the first whole life I've ever had. Dean stared at her, seeing the truth in her eyes and feeling like the biggest fool who ever lived. Sylvia, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. I'm going to George's art show next week, she said with quiet dignity, because I promised her, and because I keep my promises. After that, we'll figure out whether you actually want me here or if you're just afraid of being alone. She turned and walked toward the door, pausing only when Dean called her name. I'm sorry, he said, his voice broken. I'm sorry, and I'm an idiot, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. I know, Sylvia replied without turning around, but love isn't enough if you don't trust it. And you don't trust this, Dean. You don't trust me, and you don't trust yourself, and until you do, we're just going to keep hurting each other. She left him standing in his office, surrounded by blueprints for buildings he could design, but somehow couldn't figure out how to build a life with the woman he loved. That night, Dean lay awake listening to the house settle around him, acutely aware of Sylvia's presence in the guest room down the hall. He replayed their fight over and over, hearing his own words and recognizing the fear behind them. William's interest in Sylvia had triggered something primal and possessive in Dean, but underneath that was the deeper terror that she would eventually realize she deserved better than a grieving widower and his complicated baggage. 3 rooms away, Sylvia lay in her own sleepless state, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Dean would ever be able to fully let go of the past. She understood his fears. They echoed her own, but she couldn't build a future with someone who saw her as a sacrifice rather than a choice. The next few days passed in careful politeness as they navigated around each other for George's sake. Dean worked longer hours, while Sylvia threw herself into preparing for George's art show with single-minded determination. It was the night before the show when Georgia noticed the tension between her 2 favorite adults. Are you and Daddy fighting? She asked as Sylvia braided her hair before bed. Not fighting exactly, Sylvia said carefully. Sometimes adults need to work through complicated feelings. About loving each other? Sylvia's hand stilled in George's hair. What makes you think that? Because you both look sad now, Georgia said with the devastating honesty of childhood. And Daddy keeps staring at you when he thinks nobody's looking, like he wants to say something but doesn't know how. Your daddy and I are figuring some things out, Sylvia said gently. But no matter what happens between us, you know I love you, right? Georgia turned in her chair to face Sylvia fully. Are you going to leave us? The question hit Sylvia like a punch to the chest. Oh, sweetheart. Because if you are, I understand, Georgia continued, her young voice trying to be brave. Mommy had to leave us too, and she didn't want to. Maybe you don't want to either. Sylvia knelt in front of George's chair, taking her small hands in both of hers. Listen to me very carefully. I am not going anywhere because I have to. If I ever leave, it will only be because your daddy and I can't figure out how to be happy together. But that has nothing to do with you, and it doesn't mean I love you any less. Promise? I promise, Sylvia said, pressing a kiss to George's forehead. You are one of the best things that ever happened to me, Georgia Ashbourne. Don't you ever forget that." That night, George's words echoed in Sylvia's mind as she prepared for bed. She was brushing her teeth when Dean appeared in the doorway of the guest bathroom, his expression uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Sylvia rinsed and set down her toothbrush before turning to face him. "Georgia asked me if I was going to leave." Pain flashed across Dean's features. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that I'm not going anywhere unless we can't figure out how to be happy together." Dean leaned against the doorframe, looking exhausted. "I've been an ass." "Yes, you have," Sylvia agreed without malice. "I'm scared," Dean admitted. "I'm scared that I'm asking too much of you, that I'm being selfish, that I'm going to mess this up and lose both you and Georgia in the process. And I'm scared that you're never going to fully trust that I'm here because I want to be," Sylvia replied. "That you're always going to see me as some kind of noble sacrifice instead of a woman who chose you." They stared at each other across the small bathroom, both recognizing the truth in the other's words. "I don't know how to do this," Dean said finally. "I don't know how to love someone new without feeling like I'm betraying the past. And I don't know how to trust that someone could choose me first," Sylvia replied. "We're both terrified, Dean. But being terrified separately isn't working." Dean pushed off the doorframe and took a step closer. "What are you suggesting?" "That we be terrified together," Sylvia said simply. "That we trust each other enough to be honest about our fears instead of letting them drive us apart." "I'm afraid you'll realize you deserve better," Dean said, his voice barely audible. "I'm afraid you'll never stop seeing me as second best," Sylvia replied. They looked at each other in the soft bathroom light, two broken people finally admitting their deepest fears. "For what it's worth," Dean said, reaching out to touch her cheek, "you're not second best. You're not a replacement or a substitute. You're the woman I want to build a future with, if you'll let me." "And you're not asking too much," Sylvia said, covering his hand with hers. "You're asking me to be part of a family I already love more than my own life." Dean leaned down and kissed her then, soft and sure, and Sylvia felt the last of her walls crumble. This was what love was supposed to feel like, not desperate or grasping, but certain and sure and absolutely right. When they broke apart, Dean rested his forehead against hers. "Tomorrow, after George's art show," he said quietly, "I want to take you somewhere. Just the two of us. I want to show you something." "What?" Sylvia asked. "A future," Dean replied, "if you're ready to see it." The next evening, after George's art show, where her painting of their family had won first place, and Dean had proudly introduced Sylvia as the woman who makes our house a home, Dean kept his promise. He drove them to a hill overlooking the city, where the lights spread out below them like stars. The building site for Dean's latest project was visible in the distance, its solar panels gleaming in the moonlight. "Leah and I used to come here when we were dating," Dean said as they sat on the hood of his truck, looking out over the view. She said it reminded her that there was a whole world full of possibilities. Sylvia waited, understanding that he was working up to something important. "I stopped coming here after she died," Dean continued. "It hurt too much, remembering how hopeful we used to be. But tonight, with you, it doesn't hurt anymore. It just feels like possibility again." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious in the moonlight. "I want to build a life with you, Sylvia. Not because you're convenient or because Georgia needs a mother, but because you make me believe in tomorrow again." Sylvia felt her heart swell with emotion. "Dean, I know we have things to figure out," he continued. "Your job, where we'll live, how to blend our lives together. But I know that I want to figure them out with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sylvia's breath caught in her throat as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. Not a diamond, but a deep blue sapphire surrounded by tiny stars. "It's not an engagement ring," Dean said quickly, seeing her wide eyes. "Not yet. It's a promise ring, a promise that I'm all in, that I want to build something real and lasting with you. Sylvia stared at the ring, tears gathering in her eyes. Dean, it's beautiful, but the sapphire reminded me of the night sky the first time I saw you smile, Dean continued, his voice soft with memory. At Leah's birthday party 15 years ago, you were laughing at something George's babysitter had said, and for just a moment, I forgot to breathe. You remember that? Sylvia whispered. I remember everything about that night, Dean said, including the fact that I noticed you in a way that terrified me because I was supposed to be completely devoted to my wife. He took the ring from the box and held it between them. I can't promise we won't have hard days. I can't promise that grief won't sometimes get in the way, or that we won't have to work through complicated feelings about the past. But I can promise that I choose you, Sylvia, every day for all the days we have left. Sylvia looked at the ring, then up at Dean's face, seeing the love and certainty there. What does this mean for us, for Georgia? It means we stop pretending this is temporary, Dean said. It means we start planning a real future together. It means, he took a shaky breath, it means I'm asking you to marry me eventually when you're ready. When we've figured out all the logistics, and Georgia's had time to adjust, and you've decided whether you can really handle being part of our complicated life. And if I say yes? Sylvia asked, her voice barely audible. Then we go home and tell Georgia that she's getting the mother she's been praying for, Dean said. Then we figure out how to move your life here, or whether we should move somewhere new where we can start fresh. Then we plan a wedding in Leah's garden, because I think she'd like that. Sylvia closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. A life, a real life, with him and Georgia, built on love instead of obligation. The sapphire, she said suddenly, opening her eyes. You said it reminded you of that night 15 years ago. Yes. Leah was wearing blue that night, Sylvia remembered. A midnight blue dress that made her look like a princess. Dean's face went very still. You remember what she was wearing? I remember everything about that night too, Sylvia admitted, including the moment I realized I was in love with my best friend's boyfriend, and what a terrible person that made me. It didn't make you terrible, Dean said fiercely. It made you human, and it made you run away before you could hurt anyone, which is more than most people would have done. He held up the ring again. So what do you say? Will you wear my promise and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I choose you? Sylvia looked at the ring, at Dean's hopeful face, at the city lights spread out below them like a blanket of stars. She thought about George's painting hanging in their living room, about the way Dean's eyes lit up when she walked into a room, about the life they'd already begun building together. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll wear your promise. Dean's face broke into a smile, brighter than all the city lights combined. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. I love you, he said, pulling her into his arms. I love you so much it scares me. I love you too, Sylvia replied, then kissed him with all the passion and promise she'd been holding back for months. They kissed on the hillside overlooking the city, two hearts finally free to love without reservation, and when they broke apart, both breathing hard, Dean rested his forehead against hers. Take me home, Sylvia whispered. Take me home and make love to me like I'm the only woman in your world. Dean's eyes darkened with desire and something deeper, reverence maybe, or wonder that she was really his. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The drive home passed in charged silence, Dean's hand holding Sylvia's on the gear shift, both of them acutely aware of what awaited them. When they pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light Jennifer had left on for them. George is asleep at your mother-in-law's house, Dean said, his voice rough with want. She won't be home until tomorrow afternoon. Good, Sylvia said simply, because I want to take my time with you. They walked to the front door together, Dean fumbling slightly with his keys in his eagerness. Inside, the house felt different, not like a place where Sylvia was visiting, but like home. Their home. Dean turned to face her in the entryway, suddenly uncertain. Sylvia. She silenced him with a kiss, pouring all her love and want into the contact. When they broke apart, she took his hand and led him toward the stairs. Your room, she said, quietly. It should be your room. Dean understood what she was saying, that she wasn't trying to replace Leah, but that she was ready to build something new in the space where he'd once shared his life with another woman. His bedroom had been redecorated months ago. All traces of Leah's presence moved to storage or George's room. It was masculine now, peaceful, a space where Dean could rest without being haunted by memories. Moonlight streamed through the windows as they stood facing each other beside the bed, suddenly shy despite the passion that had brought them here. I want you to know, Dean said, reaching up to cup her face, that this isn't about need or convenience or filling a void. This is about love, about choosing you because you're you. I know, Sylvia replied, covering his hands with hers, and I want you to know that I'm not here because I settled or because this felt safe. I'm here because you're the love of my life, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Dean kissed her then, slow and deep, and time seemed to stop as years of suppressed longing finally found expression. Sylvia's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Dean groaned at the contact. I want to see you, he whispered against her lips, all of you. I want to memorize every inch of you. With trembling hands, he reached for the buttons of her blouse, pausing to look into her eyes for permission. When she nodded, he began to undress her with reverent care, pressing kisses to each new expanse of skin revealed. Sylvia returned the favor, her fingers making quick work of his shirt buttons, her touch leaving trails of fire across his chest. When they finally stood before each other with nothing hidden, Dean felt his breath catch at her beauty. You're perfect, he whispered, his hands tracing the curves of her waist, the line of her throat, the softness of her skin. You're absolutely perfect. So are you, Sylvia replied, her voice husky with desire. I've imagined this so many times, but the reality is so much better. They came together on the bed like dancers who'd been learning the same choreography their entire lives, hands and mouths exploring with growing urgency. Dean worshipped her body with patient thoroughness, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch against him, what made her whisper his name like a prayer. When Sylvia's hands found him, Dean thought he might lose his mind from the pleasure of her touch. She was generous and bold, giving herself to him without reservation, and he felt something break open in his chest at the complete trust she showed him. I need you, Sylvia whispered against his ear, her body moving restlessly beneath his. Please, Dean, I need all of you. Are you sure? Dean asked, even as his body screamed for completion. Once we do this, there's no going back. I don't want to go back, Sylvia said fiercely. I want to go forward with you, starting right now. Dean positioned himself above her, looking into her eyes as he joined them together, slowly, carefully, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. Instead, he saw wonder and love and a completeness that matched his own. They moved together with increasing passion, years of suppressed desire finally finding release. Dean watched Sylvia's face as she lost herself in sensation and felt his own control slipping as she whispered words of love and encouragement against his skin. When release finally claimed them both, it was with an intensity that left them breathless and shaking in each other's arms. Dean collapsed beside Sylvia, pulling her against his chest, both of them struggling to return to earth. That was, Sylvia began, then trailed off, apparently unable to find words. Perfect, Dean finished, pressing a kiss to her hair. That was perfect. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, hands stroking and hearts gradually slowing. Finally, Sylvia propped herself up on her elbow to look at Dean's face. "No regrets?" she asked softly. "Only that we waited so long," Dean replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "What about you?" "I feel like I'm finally home," Sylvia said simply. "Like all the years of waiting led me exactly where I was supposed to be." Dean pulled her down for another kiss, slow and sweet and full of promise. "Welcome home," he whispered against her lips. "Welcome to our life." They made love again as dawn approached, slower this time, savoring each touch and caress. And when morning came, they woke tangled together in Dean's bed, rings on their fingers and love in their hearts, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because they'd finally learned the most important truth of all. Some love stories take 15 years to begin, but once they start, they're worth every moment of waiting. Chapter 4. The morning after their night together, Dean and Sylvia woke to find their world fundamentally changed, not just because they'd finally become lovers, but because everything felt possible now in ways it never had before. Dean opened his eyes first, immediately aware of Sylvia's warm weight against his side, her hand resting over his heart where it had fallen during sleep. The sapphire promise ring caught the morning light, sending tiny rainbows across the ceiling, and Dean felt a surge of contentment so profound it almost overwhelmed him. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured when Sylvia stirred against him. She hummed, pressing a kiss to his chest. "Is it wrong that I never want to leave this bed?" "Not wrong at all," Dean chuckled, his arms tightening around her. "But unfortunately, we have a daughter to collect and a life to start living." The mention of Georgia brought reality flooding back. They would have to tell her about their relationship, about the promise ring, about the future they were planning together. Dean found himself nervous about how his perceptive daughter would react to the confirmation of what she'd already suspected. How do we tell her?" Sylvia asked, voicing his thoughts. "Honestly," Dean said after a moment, "she's too smart for anything else and she deserves to understand what's happening to her family." They showered together, an intimacy that felt both thrilling and natural, and prepared breakfast with the easy coordination of people who'd finally stopped fighting their connection. By the time Jennifer arrived with Georgia, they'd settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt like home. "Daddy! Sylvia!" Georgia burst through the front door with her usual enthusiasm, launching herself into hugs that both adults returned with perhaps more intensity than usual. "Did you have fun at Grandma Jennifer's house?" Sylvia asked, smoothing Georgia's sleep-mussed hair. "Uh-huh. We made cookies and watched movies, and she showed me pictures of Mommy when she was little." Georgia paused, studying their faces with sudden focus. "You both look different this morning." Dean and Sylvia exchanged a glance, amused despite their nerves by Georgia's uncanny ability to read them. "Different how?" Dean asked. "Happy different," Georgia said decisively. "Like Christmas morning different. Did something good happen?" Jennifer appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Yes," she said slowly. "Something definitely happened. You can practically see it in the air between them." Heat crept up Sylvia's neck under Jennifer's scrutiny. Dean's mother-in-law had been polite, but distant since Sylvia's arrival, clearly protective of Leah's memory and suspicious of any changes to their carefully maintained routine. "Maybe we should all sit down," Dean suggested, his hand finding Sylvia's and squeezing gently. "Georgia, there's something Sylvia and I want to talk to you about." They settled in the living room, Georgia perched expectantly on the couch between her two favorite adults, while Jennifer remained standing by the window, her expression carefully neutral. "You know how much Sylvia and I care about each other," Dean began carefully. "You mean how much you love each other," Georgia corrected matter-of-factly. "I told you, grown-ups are terrible at keeping secrets." Dean laughed despite his nerves. "Right, how much we love each other. Well, last night we decided that we want to make that official." He lifted Sylvia's hand to show Georgia the promise ring, and his daughter's eyes went wide with delight. "You're getting married?" Georgia squealed, bouncing on the couch cushions. "Eventually," Sylvia said gently. "This is a promise ring. It means your daddy and I are committed to building a future together, but we want to take things slowly to make sure everyone's comfortable with the changes." Georgia threw her arms around both of them in an exuberant hug. "This is the best day ever. I'm getting a new mommy." The word mommy hung in the air like a blessing and a challenge. Dean felt Sylvia tense slightly beside him, and he knew she was thinking of Leah, of the woman whose place she could never truly take. "Sweetheart," Dean said carefully, "Sylvia will never replace your real mommy. No one could do that." "I know," Georgia said seriously, pulling back to look at them both. "Mommy will always be my first mommy, the one who gave birth to me and taught me how to paint flowers. But Sylvia can be my forever mommy, the one who takes care of me and loves me and helps me grow up." The simple wisdom of her daughter's words brought tears to Dean's eyes. Leave it to Georgia to understand what the adults had been struggling with for months. "That's exactly right," Sylvia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I could never replace your mommy, but I would be honored to be your forever mommy, if you'll have me." "Yes," Georgia launched herself at Sylvia again. "I've been wishing for this since you came back to us." From her position by the window, Jennifer cleared her throat pointedly. "This is all very touching," she said, her tone carefully controlled. "But don't you think you're moving rather quickly? Leah's only been gone 2 years. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees." Dean felt Sylvia stiffen beside him, while Georgia looked confused by the sudden tension. "Jennifer," Dean said quietly, "we understand your concerns." "Do you?" Jennifer interrupted, moving closer. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been planning this replacement for quite some time. How convenient that Leah's best friend was available to step into her life the moment she was gone." "Jennifer," Dean's voice sharpened with warning. "It's okay," Sylvia said softly, though her face had gone pale. "She has a right to her feelings." "Yes, I do," Jennifer continued, her protective instincts for her daughter's memory overriding diplomacy. "I have a right to question whether this is about love or convenience. I have a right to worry about my granddaughter being confused about who her real mother is." "Grandma Jennifer," Georgia said, her young voice cutting through the adult tension, "you're being mean to Sylvia." "I'm being honest, sweetheart," Jennifer replied, her tone gentling for Georgia. "Sometimes adults need to ask hard questions." "Then let me answer them," Dean said, standing to face his mother-in-law directly. "Yes, this feels fast from the outside, but Sylvia and I have known each other for 15 years. She was Leah's closest friend, someone our family trusted and loved long before I became a widower." He moved to stand behind Sylvia's chair, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders. "This isn't about replacement or convenience. This is about 3 people who love each other choosing to become a family." "And what about Leah?" Jennifer asked, tears starting to gather in her eyes. "What about honoring her memory? What about respecting the life you built with my daughter?" The pain in Jennifer's voice broke through Dean's defensiveness, reminding him that she was grieving too, that Leah had been her only child. "Jennifer," he said more gently, "loving Sylvia doesn't mean I loved Leah any less. It doesn't mean I'm forgetting her or moving on like she never mattered. It means I'm choosing to live instead of just survive." "Mommy would want Daddy to be happy," Georgia added with 8-year-old certainty. "She told me that before she went to heaven. She said Daddy had too much love in his heart to be sad forever." Jennifer's composure cracked at Georgia's words, tears spilling over as she looked at her granddaughter's earnest face. "She said that," Jennifer whispered. Georgia nodded solemnly. "She said love doesn't run out when you give it away. It just makes more room for more love." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion and possibility. Jennifer looked at Sylvia, really looked at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You loved her too," Jennifer said quietly. "Leah. You loved her like a sister." "I did," Sylvia replied, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "She was the best person I ever knew. And you're right to protect her memory and to question whether I'm worthy of this family. But I promise you, Jennifer, I would never dishonor what Leah built here. I'm trying to add to it, not replace it." Jennifer studied Sylvia's face for a long moment, then looked at Dean and Georgia, seeing the peace and happiness that had been missing from their home for 2 years. "Leah used to worry about what would happen to you both after she was gone," Jennifer said finally. "She made me promise to take care of you, but I couldn't give you what you really needed. Maybe this is what she was hoping for." The admission seemed to cost Jennifer something, but it opened the door to healing. "I'd like us to be friends," Sylvia said gently. "I'd like Georgia to have all the family who love her, including a grandmother who keeps her mother's memory alive." Jennifer nodded slowly, then surprised everyone by crossing to embrace Sylvia. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was protecting the wrong things." "You were protecting your daughter," Sylvia replied, hugging her back. "That's what mothers do." Jennifer's harsh words about betraying Elena's memory hit like daggers. But is protecting the past worth sacrificing the future? Have you ever had to choose between honoring someone's memory and your own happiness? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for tomorrow's emotional conclusion. The weeks that followed Jennifer's acceptance were among the happiest Dean could remember since before Leah's illness. Sylvia formally resigned from her position in Chicago, putting her apartment on the market and beginning the process of permanently relocating her life. Dean started the paperwork to legally adopt the step-parent adoption process, wanting to ensure Sylvia would have full parental rights to Georgia. But their happiness was threatened when Dr. William Olson made an unexpected appearance at Dean's office. "I need to speak." "With you?" William said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "About Sylvia." Dean set down his coffee, immediately on guard. "What about her?" "I've been thinking about our conversation at the school," William continued, settling into the chair across from Dean's desk. "About her involvement with your family." "I'm concerned." "Concerned about what?" William leaned forward, his expression serious. "Dean, you're not thinking clearly about this situation. You're a grieving widower with a young daughter, and Sylvia is taking advantage of your vulnerability." Dean's jaw tightened. "That's not—" "Listen to me," William interrupted. "I've seen this before. Caretakers who become romantically involved with their charges during times of crisis. It's a recognized psychological phenomenon. The person in need becomes dependent on their caregiver, mistaking gratitude and convenience for love. Sylvia isn't taking advantage of anyone," Dean said coldly. "Isn't she?" William pressed. "Think about it rationally. She appears at your most desperate moment, swoops in to save your family, makes herself indispensable to both you and your daughter. Now she's wearing your ring and planning to become George's stepmother. That's a significant upgrade from unemployed nanny." Dean stood abruptly, his hands flat on his desk. "You need to leave, now." "I'm trying to help you," William insisted. "Sylvia is a beautiful woman, but she's also calculating. She's been playing a long game, positioning herself to inherit the life your wife built." "Get out," Dean said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What happens when the novelty wears off?" William continued, seemingly oblivious to Dean's growing anger. "When you realize you've traded your grief for a different kind of trap. Georgia will be the one who suffers when this arrangement falls apart." Dean came around the desk so fast that William barely had time to stand before Dean was in his face. "I said get out," Dean repeated, his voice carrying a threat that made William take a step back. "And if you ever speak about my family like that again, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." William left, but his words lingered like poison in Dean's mind. By the time Dean arrived home that evening, doubt had taken root and begun to grow. He found Sylvia in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner, Georgia at the table working on homework. The scene was so domestic, so perfect, that William's accusations seemed to gain credibility. Was this real? Or was Sylvia simply very good at creating the illusion of family? "How was your day?" Sylvia asked, looking up with a smile that usually melted his defenses. "Fine," Dean replied curtly, moving to pour himself a drink instead of greeting her with their usual kiss. Sylvia's smile faltered at his tone. "Is everything okay?" "Just tired," Dean said, avoiding her eyes. Over dinner, Dean found himself analyzing every interaction, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. When Sylvia laughed at George's jokes, was it genuine or performance? When she touched his hand across the table, was it affection or strategy? The doubt grew over the following days as Dean withdrew emotionally, watching Sylvia with new suspicion. She tried to bridge the distance between them, but Dean remained guarded, William's words echoing in his mind. It was Georgia who finally forced the issue. "Why are you being mean to Sylvia?" she asked one evening after Sylvia had gone to bed early, claiming a headache. "I'm not being mean," Dean said, though he knew he was lying. "Yes, you are," Georgia insisted with 8-year-old directness. "You don't talk to her anymore, and you don't hug her, and yesterday I saw her crying in the laundry room." The image of Sylvia crying alone hit Dean like a physical blow. "She was crying. She's trying to pretend everything's okay, but she's sad," Georgia continued. "Did you have a fight?" Dean knelt in front of his daughter, seeing the worry in her young face. Sometimes adults have complicated feelings that are hard to explain. "Do you still love her?" The question pierced straight through Dean's defenses. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I love her very much." "Then why are you making her sad?" Dean couldn't answer that question because the truth was too complicated for an 8-year-old to understand. How could he explain that he was afraid of being fooled, afraid of having his grief manipulated, afraid of discovering that their love was built on lies? That night, unable to sleep, Dean found himself standing outside Sylvia's bedroom door, listening to the soft sounds of her crying. The knowledge that he was causing her pain felt like a knife in his chest, but William's words held him paralyzed. The crisis came 3 days later, when Sylvia made a decision that changed everything. Dean arrived home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and plane tickets printed beside her. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble when he walked in. "I'm flying back to Chicago tomorrow morning." Dean felt the world tilt on its axis. "What?" "I can't do this anymore," Sylvia continued, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I can't live with someone who looks at me like I'm a stranger. I can't pretend everything's fine when you obviously regret everything that's happened between us." "I don't regret—" "Don't," Sylvia interrupted. "Don't lie to me, Dean. Whatever's changed your mind about us, just be honest about it. I deserve that much." Dean stared at her, seeing the pain in her eyes and realizing what his withdrawal had cost them both. "William came to see me," he said finally. Sylvia's expression didn't change. "And he said things about you, about us, about your motivations for being here." "What kind of things?" Dean repeated William's accusations, watching Sylvia's face go very still as he spoke. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "And you believed him," Sylvia said quietly. "I don't know what to believe," Dean admitted. "Everything he said made sense. The timing, the way you fit so perfectly into our lives, how convenient it all was." "Convenient," Sylvia repeated, the word like ice. "Is that what you think this has been for me?" "Convenient." "I don't know what to think," Dean said desperately. "I just know that William's not wrong about the pattern. Caretakers who take advantage of grieving families." "Stop," Sylvia said, standing abruptly. "Just stop talking." She moved to the window, staring out at Leah's garden with her arms wrapped around herself like armor. "Do you want to know why I really stayed away after Leah died?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Sylvia, because I was afraid of exactly this moment," she continued. "I was afraid that someday you'd look at me and wonder if I'd been playing the long game, if I'd been waiting for her to die so I could move in on her life." She turned to face him, and Dean saw devastation in her eyes that cut him to the bone. "I loved Leah like a sister, but I've been in love with you since I was 18 years old," Sylvia said. "Do you have any idea what that's like? Watching your best friend marry the man you love and having to smile through the wedding, pretending to be happy while your heart breaks into 1,000 pieces." Dean felt sick, seeing the pain he'd caused written across her face. "I stayed away because I knew that if I came here while you were grieving, people would think exactly what William thinks now, that I was manipulating the situation, taking advantage of your vulnerability. So I sacrificed my own chance to say goodbye to my best friend to protect you from exactly these accusations." "I'm sorry," Dean whispered. "I'm so sorry." "No, you're not," Sylvia said with quiet dignity. "You're confused and scared and looking for reasons to push me away before I can hurt you. And I understand that, Dean. I really do. But I can't fight for someone who doesn't trust me enough to defend our love against a jealous man's accusations." She moved toward the stairs, then paused at the bottom. "Tell Georgia I love her," Sylvia said without turning around. "Tell her this isn't her fault, that sometimes adults make mistakes that break their own hearts." Dean watched her walk upstairs, heard her bedroom door close quietly, and realized he might have just lost the best thing that had ever happened to his family. Upstairs, Sylvia packed with mechanical efficiency, each folded item of clothing another step away from the life she'd thought they were building together. The promise ring sat on the nightstand, catching the lamplight like tears. Downstairs, Dean sat in his kitchen and finally understood what he'd done. In trying to protect himself from potential manipulation, he'd destroyed something real and beautiful and true. He'd let fear and suspicion poison the love that had brought his family back to life. When Georgia came home from her friend's house an hour later, she found Dean sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. "Where's Sylvia?" she asked, dropping her backpack by the door. "She's upstairs packing," Dean said, his voice hollow. "She's leaving tomorrow." Georgia went very still. "Why?" "Because I was afraid," Dean admitted. "Because someone told me things that made me doubt whether she really loved us, and instead of trusting my heart, I listened to my fear." "That's stupid," Georgia said with devastating 8-year-old honesty. "Yes," Dean agreed. "It really is." Georgia climbed into his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "Are you going to fix it?" "I don't know if I can," Dean said. "I hurt her very badly." "Daddy," Georgia said seriously, "remember what Mommy used to say about mistakes?" Dean smiled sadly at the memory. "That they're only permanent if you don't learn from them." "So learn," Georgia said simply. "Learn and fix it." That night, Dean lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to repair the damage he'd done. Across the hall, Sylvia's light stayed on until the early hours of morning, and Dean imagined her lying awake too, both of them separated by more than just a hallway. Morning came too soon, bringing the sound of Sylvia moving around her room, gathering her belongings. Dean stood in his bedroom doorway, listening to the sounds of her leaving and feeling his heart break with each footstep. By the time he worked up the courage to face her, Sylvia was already downstairs with her suitcases, calling a taxi to take her to the airport. "Don't go," Dean said from the kitchen doorway. Sylvia looked up from her phone, her face carefully composed. "My flight leaves in 3 hours." "Then cancel it," Dean said desperately. "Please, Sylvia." "Let me try to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," Sylvia replied quietly. "You showed me who you really are when the pressure was on. You chose suspicion over trust, fear over love. I can't build a life with someone who will always wonder if I have ulterior motives." "I was wrong," Dean said, moving closer. "William was wrong, and I was an idiot for listening to him. Everything he said was poison, designed to make me doubt the best thing in my life." "It doesn't matter now," Sylvia said, though Dean could see the tears she was trying to hold back. "The damage is done." "It matters to me," Dean insisted. "It matters to Georgia." "She asked me this morning if I was going to fix my mistake, and I told her I didn't know if I could. But I have to try, Sylvia. I have to try because losing you would be the biggest mistake of my life." Before Sylvia could respond, Georgia appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas. "You're really leaving?" Georgia asked, her voice small and heartbroken. Sylvia knelt in front of Georgia, taking her small hands in both of hers. "I have to, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt even when they don't want to." "But you love us," Georgia said, tears starting to fall. "And we love you. Why can't that be enough?" "Sometimes love isn't enough if people don't trust each other," Sylvia explained gently. Georgia looked at her father with accusation in her young eyes. "You broke it," she said. "You broke our family." The simple statement hit Dean like a physical blow. "Georgia, I don't want to talk to you," Georgia said, then threw her arms around Sylvia's neck. "Please don't go. Please don't leave me too." The plea in his daughter's voice finally broke through Dean's paralysis. He couldn't let fear destroy his family. He couldn't let Sylvia walk away believing that their love had been built on lies. "I quit," Dean said suddenly. Both Sylvia and Georgia looked at him in confusion. "I quit believing in fear," Dean continued, moving to kneel beside them. "I quit listening to people who don't know our story. I quit protecting myself at the expense of the people I love most." He looked directly at Sylvia, letting her see everything in his eyes, the love, the regret, the desperate hope that it wasn't too late. "You asked me once if I would ever stop seeing you as second best," Dean said, his voice thick with emotion. "The truth is, you were never second best. You were the woman I noticed first, 15 years ago, and then spent 15 years trying not to think about because I was married to your best friend." Sylvia's breath caught in her throat. "William was right about one thing," Dean continued. "I am vulnerable and grieving and not thinking clearly. But not because you're manipulating me, because loving you feels too good to be true, because having you in our lives feels like a gift I don't deserve after everything I've lost." He reached for her hands, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. "I'm not afraid that you're taking advantage of me," Dean said. "I'm afraid that you'll realize you're too good for us. That you'll wake up one day and understand you could have a whole life with someone who doesn't come with a grieving 8-year-old and 2 years' worth of baggage." "Daddy," Georgia interrupted softly, "that's the stupidest thing you've ever said." Despite everything, Sylvia laughed, a watery sound that gave Dean hope. "Listen to your daughter," Sylvia said, wiping her eyes. "She's smarter than both of us." "Does that mean you'll stay?" Dean asked, hardly daring to breathe. Sylvia looked at him for a long moment, then at George's hopeful face, then at the promise ring she'd left on the kitchen counter beside her suitcase. "I'll stay," she said finally. "But things have to change, Dean. I can't live wondering when the next doubt will send you running scared. I can't build a life with someone who doesn't trust what we have." "Then marry me," Dean said impulsively. "Not someday, not eventually. Marry me now, today, this week. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I choose you every single day." "Today?" Sylvia's eyes went wide. "Well, maybe not today," Dean amended, glancing at Georgia. "We should probably plan a proper wedding so Georgia can help with all the details. But soon as we can arrange it." "Can I pick the flowers?" Georgia asked excitedly, apparently recovered from her tears now that the crisis was passing. "You can pick everything," Sylvia laughed, pulling Georgia into her arms. "The flowers, the music, the cake flavors. This is your wedding too, because we're all becoming a family together." Dean retrieved the promise ring from the counter and slipped it back onto Sylvia's finger where it belonged. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you enough to trust you with my heart, my daughter, and my future. And I'm sorry it took almost losing you for me to remember that." "I love you too," Sylvia replied. "All of you, baggage and complications and beautiful imperfections included." They kissed then, while Georgia cheered and the morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, and Dean felt his world click back into place. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in Leah's garden, surrounded by roses that had grown wild and beautiful under Sylvia's patient care. Georgia served as maid of honor, wearing a blue dress that matched her new mother's eyes and carrying a bouquet of flowers she'd picked herself. Jennifer walked Sylvia down the aisle, having embraced her new daughter-in-law with the fierce loyalty she'd once reserved for Leah's memory alone. Dean's business partner served as best man, while Dr. William Olson was notably absent from the guest list. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, officiated by the family pastor who'd known them all for years. When Dean and Sylvia exchanged vows, they spoke not just of love and commitment, but of honoring the past while embracing the future. "Leah will always be part of our family," Sylvia said in her vows, her voice clear and strong. "She's in George's laugh, in the garden that surrounds us, in the love that brought us all together. I promise to honor her memory while building new traditions, to mother the daughter she trusted me with, and to love the man she knew deserved happiness." Dean's vows were equally heartfelt, speaking of second chances and unexpected gifts, of learning to love without fear and trust without reservation. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Georgia cheered louder than anyone, and when they kissed to seal their union, it felt like every broken piece of their lives had finally found its way home. The reception was held in the backyard, a casual celebration that felt more like a family reunion than a formal wedding. Georgia gave a speech that made everyone cry, thanking Sylvia for making Daddy smile again and teaching me that families can grow in the most beautiful ways. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Dean found Sylvia standing alone in Leah's art studio, now transformed into a combined workspace where both women's creativity could flourish side by side. "Any regrets?" he asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Only that it took us 15 years to get here," Sylvia replied, leaning back against his chest, "and that Leah couldn't be here to see it." "She is here," Dean said softly, pressing a kiss to Sylvia's temple. "She's in every part of this day, every part of our future. She's the reason we found each other again." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the window as Georgia played in the garden with her cousins, her laughter echoing off the evening air. "What happens now?" Sylvia asked. "Now we live," Dean said simply. "We raise our daughter, we love each other, we build the life we almost threw away. We prove that some love stories are worth waiting 15 years to begin." 3 months later, Sylvia's pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines, and George's prayers for a baby brother or sister were finally answered. Jennifer cried happy tears when they told her the news, and even admitted that she thought Leah would be overjoyed to know her best friend was carrying on the family legacy. The baby, a boy they named Samuel Leah Ashbourne, honoring both the future and the past, was born 9 months later in the same hospital where Georgia had been born 8 years earlier. Dean held his son for the first time and marveled at how full his heart could feel, how love really did multiply rather than divide when shared generously. Sylvia recovered quickly from the birth, her body and heart both designed for motherhood in ways that amazed Dean daily. Watching her nurse their son while Georgia read stories to both of them, Dean understood that he hadn't lost a wife and gained a replacement. He had learned to love more deeply, more completely than he'd ever thought possible. One evening, when Samuel was 6 months old and Georgia was 10, Dean found his family in the garden Leah had planted and Sylvia had restored. Georgia was teaching her baby brother to feel the texture of rose petals, while Sylvia dead-headed the spent blooms, her movements graceful and sure. "I have something for you," Dean said, pulling a wrapped canvas from behind his back. Sylvia looked up, curious. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," Dean replied. "Just love." She unwrapped the canvas to reveal Leah's unfinished painting, the garden in spring, with figures of a man and child in the corner. But now the painting was complete, finished by a local artist who'd worked from Dean's detailed descriptions. The man and child had been joined by a woman with dark hair and gentle hands, and a baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "It's perfect," Sylvia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's absolutely perfect." "Now it shows the whole family," Georgia said proudly. "Past and present and future, all together." That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Dean and Sylvia hung the completed painting in their bedroom where they could see it every morning when they woke. "Thank you," Sylvia said as they prepared for bed, "for fighting for us, for trusting love over fear, for giving me the family I never thought I'd have." "Thank you," Dean replied, pulling her into his arms, "for waiting 15 years for me to be ready to love you the way you deserve." They made love that night with the tenderness of people who'd learned not to take each other for granted, who understood that every day together was a gift not everyone receives. And afterward, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms, Dean thought about the journey that had brought them here. Through loss and healing, fear and trust, the long road from grief to joy. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone new. They're about finding the courage to accept the love that's been waiting patiently in the shadows. Dean and Sylvia's journey reminds us that healing doesn't mean forgetting, and choosing happiness doesn't betray those we've lost. In Leah's garden, where love first bloomed 15 years ago, a new chapter continues to unfold. Georgia's laughter echoes through the roses her mother planted, now tended by the woman who loves her as fiercely as any biological mother could. Samuel grows strong and happy in the arms of parents who understand that love multiplies when shared freely. Dean's smile reaches his eyes again, the grief lines softened by joy he thought he'd never feel again. Love doesn't replace what we've lost. It builds upon the foundation of what we've learned about loving. Leah's blessing lives on in the family she unknowingly helped create, her best friend's patient devotion becoming the bridge between past and future. In the end, the greatest gift isn't avoiding loss, it's learning to love again after loss, trusting that hearts have infinite capacity for joy if we're brave enough to keep them open. Dean and Sylvia's story proves that some love is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth risking everything to claim. And in the quiet moments between chaos and celebration, when the house settles around their sleeping family and moonlight streams through windows that have witnessed both sorrow and joy, Dean and Sylvia hold each other close and marvel at the beautiful complexity of hearts that have learned to love without reservation. Their love story took 15 years to begin, but now that it has started, it will last for all the years they have left, a testament to patience, to trust, to the radical courage required to build happiness on the ashes of grief. Have you ever discovered that the love you needed was closer than you imagined? Share your thoughts about second chances and unexpected love in the comments below. What wisdom would you give to someone afraid to love again after loss? Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories about love's surprising paths, and hit that notification bell so you never miss tomorrow's touching tale. Your support means everything to our Dear Love Diaries family. Until tomorrow, remember, sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that take 15 years to begin.